All right. So I decided to sort of put things in perspective for those of you. I suspect there's probably people in this room who haven't really thought a lot about longevity risk before. It's not something that's necessarily intuitive. And so I wanted to sort of put this into more of a global perspective about what it is we're trying to do and really the complexity of the problem. Because we're talking about the markets and we're talking about these results and the volatility and the modeling, but what is it we're modeling? So here we go. First idea, yes, this is important. I think everybody hit this very well, and you've got a lot of definitions of this. And Michael drove this home when he just talked about this. This really matters a lot when you're managing a pension fund and you're pricing annuities, because this is a systemic risk that you can't hedge. I can't pull this away. I have to build this cost into pensions and annuities, which is why the potential development of a market for these hedges, which is what Andrew and Guy were talking about, is actually very powerful. And it actually helps to securitize retirement going forward, because this means that this is something that I can fix the price for instead of having to build big margins in just in case. So basic definitions, just to make sure we're all on the same page. I promise I won't spend a lot of time here. We're trying to figure out how mortality rates improve. And we're trying to figure this out for all populations. And so what we're talking about are improvement rates, and how these are generally expressed in is how much mortality improves, declines, it could worsen, and we'll actually talk about that when we start talking about heterogeneity in populations, from the prior year to the current year. So, second premise, believe it or not, this can be debated a lot about, is mortality actually improving? History shows, this is just census data for the last 100 years. I've only shown males to keep it quick. How mortality has improved. I'm showing life expectancy at age 5. Obviously, there was big improvements in infant mortality. I decided to ignore those. But also at age 65. So you can see most of the mortality improvement we've seen over the last 100 years has been pre-65, but there has been a steady increase in post-retirement mortality. And obviously, for all of us, that's the thing we're most worried about. So idea number 3 is, if there's been this steady improvement, we have to build this into our mortality rates. We can't ignore this and just let the tables take care of it. Now, believe it or not, we actually always did this in tables. They were called table loads. We used to just load the tables 7%, 10%, and said that will account for the adverse deviation and improvement. So it was already in the table. So this always existed. But in the last 20 years or so, we've moved actuaries and others who are all geeked out about this stuff into explicit improvement rates. And that's where the work of Andrew and Michael come in. They're trying to help us understand what those explicit improvement rates are. And the table, if you remember I showed you the mortality table, those are based on age. So the natural thing to think about mortality improvement is, okay, so for a 65-year-old, how much is mortality going to improve between this year and next year? Problem is, it's more complicated than that. One-dimensional tables don't work too well, and I'll show you why. Two-dimensional tables better capture experience and better capture how mortality evolves, which comes down to our fourth idea, which hopefully you can see this. This is science, art, and an educated guess. Okay? The best modeling in the world is still modeling future event. Naivety and uncertainty is captured in the whole idea of what's future mortality going to be. I don't know what I don't know. I just don't know what I don't know. So, heat maps. Now, how many of you are familiar with this? So what this shows you is the rate of mortality improvement. So this is looking at how 65-year-olds, 66-year-olds, 46-year-olds, et cetera, have been dying and how those changes in those rates have happened over years. So I've got ages 50 to 100 at the top. This is from Social Security data. I've got years from 1950 to, I think this is about 2005. And this is Social Security data. To Andrew's point earlier about data and exposures, data at the oldest ages is the biggest challenge that we face. Data is very thin at the oldest ages because there just aren't that many lives. Even with a set like Social Security, you are talking relatively small numbers. And you need a lot of data to do this. So, what do all the pretty colors mean? So on the right-hand side, you can see a scale. Dark red is good. That means mortality is improving and it's improving quickly. Purple's bad, means mortality rates are actually getting worse. More people, more 65-year-olds or 70-year-olds are dying the following year than the previous year. So the circle there is how mortality reduced for 65-year-olds between 1974 and 1975, and it was about 2.5%. Now, these are very smooth. If I showed you the raw rates, it looks just more like an abstract painting, lots of pretty colors that people splattered. These are graduated and smoothed. But they start to show patterns. So let's talk about the patterns. So there's 3 ways to think about mortality improvement. There are period effects. So that says that mortality improved or declined over decades due to something. The most dramatic period effect we've seen is the effect of smoking. People started smoking, more people smoked, we saw death rates go up. Now we're seeing smoking decline, and over time we're seeing mortality rates decline as smoking and its effects works its way through the population. So that's why you can get worsening mortality rates for a period, because this is when the people who started smoking in their 20s and 30s were dying. I'm being very morbid, sorry. Age. This is actually probably the worst way to think about it because it doesn't work. Age says that mortality rates improve by age. And you can see there's no patterns going horizontally across the graph. The most interesting one, and partly why this has started in the UK, is called cohort effects. Some people in some generations see their mortality rates improve more than people in different generations. It's not as noticeable in the US. This is US data for males. It varies by males and females. I'll quickly show you some different charts so you can see just how different this looks. But cohort effects travel through on the angle. So this is a whole generation that's experiencing better or worse mortality improvement than prior generations. This is what Andrews models. All those academic papers are being written to try to figure out how this works. Just so you can see it, this is female data. Just, you notice the blue here for the males is here. Females took up smoking later, right? Women's lived, took up smoking later. So we're seeing the effects of smoking sort of work itself through the US population for females on a more delayed basis. This varies by country very quickly. England and Wales, Canada, US. We first noticed the cohort effect in England. Very strong cohort. This is, I believe, called the golden cohort. They were born in the 20s and 30s. They had, no one knows what this is, the National Health Service, rationing of food in World War II. But you can see US, not very strong cohort effects. England, very strong cohort effects. Canada in the middle. This is males. This is females. Very different. Even the golden cohort in the UK isn't quite as strong for females as it is for males. So you can see the complexity. You can see this varies by cohort, period, time, country. This is not easy stuff. So, the future, right? This is seriously where this gets tricky. So, historically what we've done is we've looked at smaller periods. This is scale AA. So these are SOA scales that we have developed for uses with mortality. So the last time we did this this was actually developed with the 94 table, so this is in the late 90s. We pulled mortality rates for about 20 years, and we just looked at this slice, and we didn't use this two-dimensional graph. And so based on that, we developed this age-based scale. Doesn't work too well, does it? Now, that's the problem with trying to do this on age. So now what we're doing is we're doing two-dimensional scales. So scale BB is we have a one-dimensional translation for it, but it's really a two-dimensional scale for males. And so the idea is this is where my experience has stopped. Unfortunately, there's a line here, but it's hard to tell with the way the monitors are divided. So this is what I know, and this is what I don't know. So what we did is we did a 10-year blending. This is stuff that was done in the UK, and we've blended out the effects of what the current experience is. We've trended it forward, and then we've just put a 1% improvement going forward. Now, this is an interim scale. We might do a longer blending when we do the more permanent scale. We were working with this data, noticed improvement rates were much different than what we had said they were going to be. We wanted to get this out to actuaries as quickly as possible, so we published this interim scale. So this is not a final scale. But the idea is you can see that you can do a two-dimensional scale that, at least in the short term, does a better job of figuring out of at least extending current trends. So, idea 5. Heterogeneity exists in populations. Don't panic. I'm just using this to illustrate a point. This was a chart in Health Affairs that they published a couple months ago. We know that mortality varies in populations. All those improvement rates I showed you were for the whole Social Security population. So I've got very poor, I've got workers, so that already takes out a whole group of people who don't get into Social Security data. But I've got people who are low, middle, and high income earners, all education levels, all sorts of different health statuses, et cetera. So we know that there's a lot of variation in that mortality, and in fact, we seem to be seeing more variation in mortality and improvement rates developing over time. So this is county data. And what I want you to think about is find your favorite urban areas. Seriously. Urban areas are where it's not just so much income, it's education, high education people cluster. And you can see that there's greater improvement in areas which are more urbanized. That was males, this is females. We are seeing mortality rates actually increasing, and I'm going to forget the researcher's name, and he's very prominent, for women who are lower educated, below high school. Now that group is shrinking, but we're seeing their mortality rates go up. So this is some of what Guy was talking about. You have to know your population. I'm just doing this on an aggregate level, but this is really a big deal about the populations. So modeling is always going to be imperfect. And this is some of the stuff we're going to do, and then I'll wrap up. I'll save this. But we know the data is bad. We know it's out of date. A lot of the stuff Michael's talking about is using, he did it on an aggregate basis, but it's using sort of more life history to be able to help you understand mortality rates. Well, guess what? You're lucky if you get exposures. You're lucky if you know who's alive and who's dead. That's really about what you get. And so it doesn't come with life history. And the older you get, the harder it gets to pull the data. It's very inaccurate and very thin. Complexity may not yield accuracy, right? We're predicting the future. We don't know what's going to go on. Don't get me wrong, the models that Andrew is talking about are actually a great leap forward in mortality improvement understanding, but you can really get a lot of complexity. And he goes into that more in the paper than he did in his presentation. We don't know what drives it. We don't. I mean, Dr. Vopol will talk this afternoon about a lot of his work, but right now we don't know. We know what it's correlated with, income to a lesser degree. We think education may be the better correlation, but again, every death certificate doesn't come with your degrees listed on it. But finding these correlations is helpful, and that sort of gets to Guy's point about knowing your population, knowing what's driving it, understanding what's doing this, because it can help create the hedges. It can help us to understand what's going on. I'm not dismissing causation. I'm saying this is a developing science, and at this stage, correlations help a lot. And with that, I will let you guys ask your questions.